Which part are we redoing?
The whole thing. What's
Let's do it.
up?
Fired up.
What's up? Let's get fired up, man. We are here. This is the Dad's Corner Sportscast. The Dad's Corner Sportscast. Third time's a charm. I am Tony with the keys. This is Jayson Krisell to my left, and below us we have Whitlee Rainwater, who is our expert on our topic today. What we're going to be discussing. What's up, fellas? How y'all doing?
What's up, man? Doing good, Whitley. Thanks for being here, man. Thanks for the expertise that you're bringing to the podcast today.
Definitely. And not a self-proclaimed expert. I've just played fantasy football since 2001. Don't worry about my win percentage, though. I have played in several leagues year after year, so I've got a lot of reps playing fantasy football. And I'm excited for this year's. I mean, NFL kicks off in a week from now. So,
Oh man, exciting. Exciting. I'm excited. I'm really excited for the NFL. So I don't necessarily have a specific team. Like, I like a lot of teams. I really do. If I had to choose a team, I would probably choose the Chiefs out of proximity as opposed to the Cowboys out of proximity.
mm,
That's just me. That's just me. And it's not, and it's it is what it is. Say what you want to say. But I think that like
It's crazy
fantasy
how
is.
you've chosen, a winning team as well, it's just proximity. I mean,
Well, if I had so I like players, and so fantasy football is really it's perfect for what I like, but I've never done fantasy football, and so that's I was talking to you, Jason, and that's even the reason that we're even doing this segment right here is I wanted to know about fantasy football, I wanted to understand it a little better, and hopefully I'm sure there's other people that want to know a little bit better about it and how it works and what the ins and outs are. And you said I know the guy. I know the
yeah,
guy. And
Whitley's,
this guy
Whitley's got
right
his
here is
own.
the guy. Go ahead.
Yeah, he's got his own podcast,
What's the podcast?
WXY, spelled out WHY&Z. So he's got his own podcast. You've been doing it for a little over a year, Whitley. Yeah.
doing it for a
So
year.
yeah. So is it just you, or do you have kind of guests on, or how does it set up?
Yeah, so it's me and my buddy Zane. Zane lives in South Carolina, or from South Carolina, but we started up last year. We're usually both on every episode. We brought in probably 5 or 6 different guys, just different league mates that we play fantasy football with, just to get kind of some color analysts in there and mix it up a little bit.
Nice. Nice. Yeah. So Tony said we were talking about fantasy football, and he's like, yeah, I've never done a league before. And I thought, well, that can't be right. I mean, he likes sports. Like, there's no way you've never, even just for fun, because I've been doing one for almost 10 years now. I've only won once, but it's just something to do. Like we've said before, it's hard once you start a family to stay in contact, especially like with your buddy Zane not living near you. You don't get to see each other. You don't get to be around each other. So fantasy football is always a thing that every year it just kind of gets a group of guys together, and you at least get to talk a whole lot of smack to each other. You get to, once a week, at least that group chat's blowing up about who's doing well and who's not. And then the punishments at the end of the year it can be spectacular. So I'm going to touch on that a little bit later on in this podcast, but we just had a guy from last year. He fulfilled his punishment for coming in last place. So it was epic. It was really good.
Yeah, so and I've done a lot of other stuff with like football, your square boards, your bets. Like I've made bets on games that I don't even care who's playing. And so I think that this is just more of an active, you being a little bit more active. And so to seek to understand it a little better, I've got a few things, a few questions. I'll be kind of leading the charge with some questions both of y'all can answer. And really, I've just got this ledger over here. I got my cameras mixed up. This ledger over here that we'll be able to go off of and kind of just I want you to kind of tell me all the ins and outs. So first and foremost, let's get to it. Let's get to it. Draft strategies. So I think that's like the first thing, the most important thing, right? Is how you're drafting. So how do you build a strong team? What's the best approach? Draft strategies. Talk to me about that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Whitley, you've already done yours, right? You already have done your draft?
Yeah, I've done one of my leagues or two of my drafts. I have two more coming up this upcoming weekend.
Okay, go ahead. I was about to say, because I haven't done mine yet, so there's going to be definitely some heavy ears on this part, just seeing who to go for.
Yeah, so draft strategy, number one, you need to have a draft strategy and not just show up to the draft like Jason's mentioned before, like roll in there and just start picking players. It'd be kind of like showing up to a basketball game and not stretching, or, flag football game. You're probably going to blow a hamstring, especially when you're, 36 years old. So you definitely need to do a little bit of prep leading up to like 5 minutes before the draft and not do last minute cram session. That'd be advice number one. And then just looking over your league rules is important. Seeing how the scoring works. It's a little different in every league. There's a PPR league, which is points per reception. There's standard league where you don't get a point for every reception. Then there's snake drafts as far as how you select players, and auction drafts. So familiarize yourself with the league settings and kind of formulate your strategy based off of that.
Well, that's good stuff. So what I heard was have a strategy is more important than just going in and just picking people at random. So have a strategy. Awesome.
So do your leagues, Whitlee, most of them, you do PPR leagues? That's kind of what I've mainly always done.
So what's PPR? Tell me what that is.
Yeah, so we do PPR leagues, and it's points per reception. So you might have like your running back, two different running backs you're looking at. One of them, they get handed the ball a lot. Maybe they get 60 or 70 yards a game, maybe a half of a touchdown or touchdown average every game. But then you might have another running back that they toss them the ball 5 or 6 times a game. So they might have 4 or 5 receptions for every time they catch the ball. Even if they get 0 yards, they get a point for your team. So if a running back or like a high volume receiver is getting several catches every game on average, then that gives them kind of a base floor of production. And even if they don't have a high yardage total or don't fumble or fall into the end zone that week, then you still have that PPR base floor of reception total.
Okay, so that really takes us into the scoring systems, our next point. So scoring systems, you said PPR, there's a what were the other ones?
Yeah, so PPR, there's a half point PPR, so they get 1/2 of 1 point per reception. Standard is how historically fantasy leagues were before PPR got so popular, where standard league is basically just a quarterback gets 4 points for a touchdown, 1 point for every 25 yards passing. Running back and receivers for every yard for every 10 yards they rush or have a reception for, it's 1 point. And touchdowns are 6 points if they rush or receiving touchdown. And then if you're playing PPR, you also get a point per reception.
Yeah, so you got to really look at which guys are going to get. You want the touchdowns. Obviously, that's kind of the big points. But if you have a guy who is just catching a slot guy especially, who's catching a lot of passes, he's going to catch every 6 catches. I mean, it's basically a touchdown worth of points. So if it's a guy who's used a lot, sometimes they're just as good, if not better, than that one down the field threat who you're just hoping catches a long touchdown. Just somebody who's going to be utilized a lot, and who is like, that's why Christian McCaffrey. I mean, he's one of the best fantasy prospects, not only because he's a really good running back, but he catches a lot of balls. They may throw it to him, they may hand it off to him. There's so many different ways that he can score you points. Alvin Kamara was kind of the same way a few years ago. It's just players like that who are not just a running back, but who can also catch it out of the backfield. You can double up on points.
So, I love how these are just kind of leading into the next one, because now we're at player ranking. So how do those points, I guess that impacts player value. Like the value of a player is based on the type of points that they could potentially get, right? So player rankings, how are players ranked? Are they ranked just because they're going to be touching the ball a lot, or based on their skill set? Like what's their player rankings?
Yeah, so a lot is baked into player rankings. If you hop on like ESPN to do a fantasy football draft, for example, ESPN will have the ADP or the average draft position. rankings. Player CMC number 1, Tyreek Hill number 2, CeeDee Lamb number 3, Bijan Robinson number 4. They'll take past historical data of like how they finished in 2023. They'll also bake in what's changed as far as their situation, as far as their team, coaching staff, the depth chart, competition that a receiver might have for targets on their team. If they lost a quarterback, if they got a quarterback upgrade, things like that all go into consideration. And then they just project however many fantasy points they think they will get. A lot of fantasy analysts will start with a team like, say, the Indianapolis Colts, and they'll say, hey, they rushed for this many yards as a team total last year, threw for this many yards as a team total. Here's kind of the receivers, here's the running backs, here's what the quarterback, what we project. And then they'll kind of break it down, a top-down approach, and say, well, we kind of think Jonathan Taylor will touch the ball 200 times. He'll probably have a little over 1,000 yards rushing. And his touchdowns, we're guessing about 7 touchdowns for the year. And so they'll kind of break out projections that way to formulate their ADP and then recommend to you, hey, here's the top down as far as player ranking order.
What stinks, though, is if you just go off of that, you may, at the beginning of the year, have a high drafted team or a team that you're projected to win your fantasy league. Because once the draft is done, it'll show you like who's projected to win, who just based off of their team makeup and who they've gotten. And it's almost, not always, but it's almost always the person who's projected to win that doesn't even come close. Just because you have a lot of high ranked players, you need every single person to perform exactly how they thought they were going to perform, and that just doesn't happen. Not only injuries and things like that, but just other guys stepping up. Maybe a receiver is really good. They start getting doubled, and so they're not getting the ball as much. And so now you have a big name guy who was projected to do really good, but he's just been kind of quiet, or at least quiet in retrospect to what his numbers were supposed to be. So the rankings are kind of can fool you just because. And if you set your draft, so we have guys who can't show up for the draft for whatever reason, and they'll set it up on just automatically let the system kind of pick their team. Well, the system will always pick the highest ranked available player. So even though you get that available wide receiver who is next on the depth chart or who is next on the list, it may not necessarily be the best pick for you, and it'll take a person who's hurt. I mean, it just takes whoever the best ranked person is. So you may draft a guy who's injured and is sitting out the first 4 weeks, and that's a big hit in the first 4 weeks if you lose all 4 games because you've got nobody at this one position.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy. So I've heard y'all talk a lot about receptions, and as you were talking about the top, the ADP rankings, like you said, like Tyreek Hill and CeeDee Lamb, and like you're talking about receivers and stuff. So and running, like, what are the key positions that we want whenever we're picking stuff? Do you want defensive players at all? Like, does a team even have a defensive team side of it? Like, so talk to me about key positions.
Yeah, so every league lately has been kind of removing the defense and kicker. The main focus is really on quarterback, running back, receiver, tight end. Some leagues will still have you roll out a kicker in your starting lineup and a team defense. If they hold the opponent under a certain amount of points, you get points on your fantasy team. If they get interceptions, fumble recoveries, or a defensive touchdown, then they can pile up points for you. Kickers, if they score an extra point, it's usually 1 point for your team. If they hit like a 50-yard field goal, that's like 4 or 5 points. If they hit a 20-yard field goal, maybe 2 or 3 points, depending on your scoring system. Again, check your league scoring system. And then, but like I said, quarterback, running back, receiver, tight end, that's kind of the meat and potatoes of fantasy football, and especially running backs and receivers, because you have to start 2 running backs minimum and 2 receivers minimum on every league. You're usually 1 quarterback and 1 tight end. So they're still important, but if you're in a 10 or 12-man league, there's usually 10 or 12 pretty good tight ends and quarterbacks to choose from. The running backs and receivers that are high octane, high efficiency, like going to produce a lot of points, they will thin out really quick in your drafts. So most people prioritize filling those running back and receiver spots first.
Yeah, defense is one of those where you start off the game, like you start off that week with 10. Most of them are 10 points, right, Whitley? Like you start off,
yep.
Defense immediately gets 10 points. But for every, tier that an offense against them hits, it will subtract from that score. Now, if they get interceptions. But defense is one of those where it's normally you're going to get a few points. You may lose a few points. Not a big kicker. Now, there are plenty of instances, and I've had it happen against me and for me, where the defense gets 20-something points or the defense gets negative because they got absolutely torched. So you definitely, if you're playing, the Chiefs, for instance, they got so many weapons. Mahomes doesn't make a lot of errors. If your defense is playing against the Chiefs, you may want to put your other defense in. Just in terms of you don't want them to get eat up for a lot of yards. They're not going to probably get any turnovers. They're going to get scored a lot on. So you got to take all of that into consideration. But one thing on Whitley's point, the one quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, and a tight end, and then some leagues also you have a flex position. So you have a flex position where you can do a running back, wide receiver, and tight end. So you can have a third running back, a third receiver, or a second tight end. Normally the tight end's probably your last spot there. But if you have 2 just standout tight ends, you may want to do that. But yeah, so defense is lumped in as a whole. So you would just have the Chiefs defense, not a linebacker, D-line, or anybody in particular.
So let me ask y'all this. So this is it kind of goes back up to a couple of other things. Like, so on the scoring, are you trying to get to a certain amount of points, or is it just like football game, like however many points you can score, or are you trying to hit like a certain? Because you said you start off with 10 points. And as a second question, like, are there caps on these players, like on how you're able to select, or can you just select players as they're available, or do you have to be strategic with like oh, I don't want to spend too much on this player or this? Talk to me about both of those ideas and concepts.
Yeah, so you start at 0 points, but when your defense plays their game and their game kicks off, they start with 10 points. As the opponent scores more points, that 10 points they start with can lower and go all the way down to 0 if their opponent scores like more than 30 points in that NFL game. But it kind of gives them like a base floor to start with, and rewards them if they hold their opponents under a certain amount of points in that NFL game. And then you're playing a head-to-head matchup. So let's say us 3 and 7 other people are in a league. Week 1, Tony, you might be playing Jayson. And so it's just going to be your quarterback, running back, receivers, tight end, kicker, and defense against Jayson's. And whoever outscores one another will have a W on the week. Whoever doesn't will have a loss on the week and go into week 2 into your new head-to-head matchup. Most fantasy leagues, they'll play for 13 or 14 weeks of the regular season. And then even though it's still NFL regular season, they'll switch to the fantasy playoffs, and maybe the top 4 teams that had the best record throughout the regular season, first 13 or 14 weeks, will play in a head-to-head playoff bracket style to determine who's going to be the fantasy champion that year. And then as far as budgeting, if it's a snake draft, they just have like a list of, let's say Jason's first pick, you're second, I'm third. So we would just pick on best available players. When they're gone, they're gone. If it's auction, then you would just take turns nominating a certain player. We would be given like a $200 per se budget, and you could spend as much or as little as you wanted on every player until you ran out of money.
Yeah, and a couple thing on one thing that Willie just said, which is people who are new to fantasy. So the playoffs for fantasy start during the regular season of the NFL. And I'm glad that they do it, because if your team didn't make the real playoffs and you had a lot of people who weren't in the playoffs, they couldn't score. But not only that, you can't go too far into the season, because this is what happens. You get to the last 2 weeks of the regular season, you're in the playoffs or the championship. You've got, let's just say you've got Patrick Mahomes, you've got Travis Kelce, and you've got the Chiefs, defense per se. Well, the Chiefs have already locked up home field advantage for the playoffs, and they know that whether they win or lose, it's going to not affect their playoffs. Well, they're not going to play those guys. So now you're in a fantasy football championship, and your best quarterback, tight end, and defense are not even really playing. And so now you're trying to sub people in and out that like you haven't played all year or that are not doing good. So the strategy towards the end of the year in the playoffs becomes almost tougher depending on how your league is set up.
Yep, it's very tough to balance because now the NFL season is expanded to 18 weeks, and sometimes NFL teams will have a bye up until week 14. So you don't really want to be playing in the playoffs in week 14 with some players being on an NFL bye week. But also you definitely don't want to stretch your playoffs into week 18 because that's when, like Jayson said, teams that have locked up like playoff seeding are not going to play their stars.
Lots of strategies, man. Lots of ideas, concepts, and plays to make to consider. So in-season management. So this one, and I'm looking at the side over here, and I'm thinking that like some of these may go together. So in-season management, I think we can also like connect like the bye weeks, injury reports, all of that stuff inside of this. So in the season, there's a lot of stuff that happens in the real NFL. How does that affect your fantasy? And talk to me about how you manage your teams. Are you able to trade, or are you able to do anything? To bench some. Talk to me about in-season management, and you can bring up injury reports, bye weeks, stuff like that.
Yeah, so the draft is really just the beginning. Everyone's team looks pretty good on paper before the chaos of week 1 starts. And then you could be going into week 4 or 5 of the NFL season, have 2 or 3 of your guys hurt, maybe out for the year, maybe with hamstring injuries or ankle injuries, not really knowing what their game time status is going to be. Bye weeks will start rolling in, and then you're looking down your bench and your reserves thinking, like, who can I put in my starting spot now and feel good about? So the one thing to count on is chaos will just ensue when the NFL season starts. Nothing, you got to let go of whatever you thought prior to that and just look at actually what's happening. If there's a guy that no one drafted, but he's, popping off and scoring a lot of points week 1 and 2, you should go try to pick him up off of the free agent waiver wire and put him on your team. Let go of somebody else that you thought might have a good year that hasn't produced or got hurt, whatever it may be. And so, you're looking for injury updates. You don't want to start a player that might or might not play if you haven't gotten confirmation from some NFL insider that, hey, my player's playing in this Thursday night game. I don't want to just put him in my lineup and hope that he plays or hope that he's not a decoy and just rolls out there for only 5 or 6 snaps. I want to know that he's healthy and going to play the full game, that the team is going to throw him the ball or hand him the ball off like they, normally plan to. So monitoring injury updates is good just to figure out, do I start the guy this week or do I even keep him on my team for the year? If he's out for the year, if he has like an 8-week injury and it's week 3, I'm probably not going to hold on to him unless my league has an IR spot, an injured reserve spot. Because I want to put other guys on my bench that might be able to produce for me. And then I would say, you can do trades throughout the year. You can work the free agent wire and pick up guys, drop guys off your team. So I would just say, once you draft your team, try to draft your team to where you're not just concerned with the top 5 picks and be like, oh, I have Patrick Mahomes, I have CeeDee Lamb, I have 2 good running backs. Look how good my team looks on paper. Because by week 5 or 6, it's going to look a lot different. And so you want to put some time and effort and draft prep into even like the guys that aren't starting for your team. And you're going to hope that they could start for your team if need be.
Yeah, and you get to see, one thing I've noticed in the last few years is the word questionable is used for just about every single player up until game time. I mean, there will be the number of times I've looked, and it's been Thursday night. You got to have the lineup set by Thursday before the first game starts. You want to have it set by then because if one of your guys plays on Thursday night and he's questionable and you leave him in there and you didn't pay attention right up until game time and he's listed as out and that game starts and you still have him in your starting lineup, you can't do anything about it. So once that guy's game starts, you can't make any changes. But I've noticed questionable is on there a lot. Like, it's easy to say he's not in, he's not out, but he's questionable. Like, we don't know. And so, like Whitlee said, first you'll draft that first week, everybody's 100% good to go. And then literally week 2, you'll just see a lot of Qs by your guys. And so it's not saying they're in, it's not saying they're out. And so it'll be up until game time. I mean, they have a league provision to where they have to let the league know or let them know on the report that they're going to play or not. But it's pretty close to game time. So if you have life, I mean, you're not in the NFL world. You have a normal life to live. So if you don't pay attention, I've done it before and got to look at it and they're like, hey, good job leaving that kicker in there. And you look and the kicker like is out with an injury, or your running back is, 1 year, I've told this story before. 1 year, it was like 8 or 9 years ago. I had Andrew Luck, Keenan Allen, and one other guy. All three of them within the first 3 weeks of the season had a lacerated kidney. And they had that exact injury. And it was the most random injury, but they all three had it. So I lost starting quarterback, starting running back, and starting receiver within the first 3 or 4 weeks. So then you're scrambling, and a lot of times you're trying to figure out, well, who's their backup? Is their backup going to be able to step in and do what they're doing? But it's not always the case. But one thing with setting your lineup is bye weeks. If you don't pay attention during your draft and one of your draft strategies, you want to be careful, like the example I gave earlier about, I've got Mahomes and I've got Travis Kelce and I've got the Chiefs defense and I've got Butker. So I've got a great kicker, quarterback, tight end, defense. I'm solid. Well, they're all 4 going to have the same bye week. So at some point during that year, they're going to have their bye week, and you're going to have 4 people to replace. And that's if they don't have any injuries. So bye weeks are really – and that's just the Chiefs. Multiple teams will have the same bye week. So if you have them and somebody else, now you're thinking half your team's gone. You may have just given yourself a loss just because you don't have anybody to step in and replace them. So in-season management is crazy because it's every week. Sometimes, which Whitlee can talk more really about this, the matchup analysis. Sometimes even if you have 2 good tight ends, if you have one tight end who's facing the number 1 defense, and it'll show you on all these leagues, ESPN, all these different ones, Yahoo, it'll show you how good that defense or how good that tight end is going to do against that defense. So it'll say this defense is ranked 10th in the NFL against tight ends. But then it'll show that your other tight end, he's playing against a defense that's ranked 32nd. Excuse me. So you're like, well, I want to put that tight end in. But then you got to go a little bit farther and look and say, okay, but is that quarterback of the other tight end going to be able to get him the ball? So how is that quarterback going to play against that defense? So there's so many moving parts. You can't always – the numbers look good, and everybody always wants to pick the guy who's in the green on the defenses that he's facing, and he's going to do well against that. But you also got to look at the quarterback and how can the quarterback get them the ball? Are they going to be able to run against this defense? There's so many interchangeable moving parts that you got to focus on the whole team.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Go ahead.
Because if you have a receiver, let's say you have A.J. Brown on the Philadelphia Eagles, and he's going to play against the Miami Dolphins. And so you have Jalen Ramsey on the Dolphins, who's a really good secondary defensive back. And you think, okay, well, Jalen Ramsey's been shadowing everybody, the number 1 receivers every game. This year, maybe he's been locking everybody down. So I would still start a guy like A.J. Brown, but you need to consider if you do have a whole lot of really good other wide receiver options of maybe thinking about not starting A.J. Brown if you've got, like I said, really top-tier options. I wouldn't put in, a guy like Jameson Williams or a guy like Christian Kirk or somebody like that just because one of my best receivers has a tough matchup. But if you're talking about your wide receiver 2 or maybe your flex spot, and then I'm considering a couple different guys, then I'm really looking into the matchup of who's shadowing them in the secondary. What's the weather like? I mean, if they're supposed to be catching the ball and their quarterback's supposed to be throwing for a lot of yards, are they playing in an inside dome? Are they outside and it's freezing and a blizzard and high winds, or is it going to be wet out there? All that goes into consideration of, if you think these guys might outperform the other on your team. So just different factors to look at. And then also game script. I mean, because if you have a receiver and let's say the Chiefs are playing a bad team like the Patriots, I mean, the Chiefs are probably going to jump out to a 20 or 30 point lead fairly quick into the game. They're probably not going to be incentivized to keep throwing the ball and just piling on points. So game script could work in your favor or not, just depending on how the game unfolds. But you want to factor in kind of how you think the game will go, and then if it'll benefit your receiver or your running back or your quarterback.
Dude, I love this. Because ultimately you're looking at, you may have, how many players on the team? 10 players on the team, right?
Yeah, about 10. Yeah.
So you may have your 10 players, but you may have players on like 7 different teams, right? And so you're watching the matchups on like who they're against to bring up, and that's really like that matchup analysis to know who's playing who, and then also to know who your opponent is playing, who you're matching up with, who they're playing, and how you're best suited to beat them. Like, are you really just trying to do the best with your team? It doesn't matter who you're matched up with, really. Like, they're going to try to do the best with theirs, and y'all are just going at it. Y'all are just on the schedule together. But man, that's there. It's a lot of moving pieces. There is a lot of moving pieces. I like it. Like I said earlier, I love watching football. Like, it's just fun to me, and I love watching NFL. And it doesn't, like, in the house, like, it doesn't matter who's playing. Like, we always have something sports going on, some type.
But when you do this though, you do find yourself like kind of not wishing or hoping, but just kind of like, I kind of wish that guy would tweak his ankle.
No.
just like a couple plays. Like, I don't want him to get hurt. I don't want him to be injured. I want him to still get his paycheck. But maybe he could just not play the rest of this game. Maybe you get down to it, you're like, man, he only needs 10 more yards. It's the third quarter. He's probably going to get it unless he tweaks an ankle, sits out. I mean,
you're hoping that they come over the screen. The announcer says, "Well, this one could be questionable, at least during."
No, you're hoping. You're hoping
for a questionable in the game.
Yeah, they're going to sit him for the rest of the game. That's what you're wanting. You're like, it doesn't look bad, but they're up by enough. They're going to set him out for the rest of the game.
Hey, you said something earlier, and I just wanted to ask about it. So, oh gosh, what was it? Now that I wanted to ask about it. Oh, gosh, I got calls coming in. Whenever you are, gosh, we can keep going. Oh no, deadlines. So for your team, so are you able to change your like who's playing before every matchup, or is it like on a weekly basis? Whoever you have in that week, that's who plays, or is it a certain? Talk to me about that. How does that work?
Yeah, so you'll have your starter and your reserve. Let's say quarterback, if you roster 2 quarterbacks, and whichever one you have in your starter slot, the second their game kicks off, he's locked in your starter. So you can't go back and switch it even a minute after game time. So you will have to put whoever is starting on your team, the second their game starts, it's locked. So you have up until game time. And you might have your receivers, like maybe both your quarterbacks play Sunday at noon. Maybe a couple of your receivers play on different teams and they play in the Monday night or Sunday night game. So you have some time to kind of make that decision. But if anybody on your reserves plays Sunday at noon, once their game kicks off too, you can't put them into a starter spot either.
That's what I'm asking. That's what I'm asking. Like,
Monday night game could end up being Monday night could end up screwing you, because if there's a guy who's questionable on the Monday night game and then Monday midday they say, hey, he's out. Well, now you don't really have anybody else from your team to put in, because everybody else more than likely on your team has already played their game. So now you're faced with, I've got to go pick up somebody, either look at the score and say, okay, I'm out, like I've already lost, I'm not worried about it, or man, I got a real chance of winning this, and maybe you go try to pick up the backup from waiver if he's not already on somebody else's team. Worst case scenario is you kind of have to just sit there and watch that your team's going to lose, knowing that you don't have another person to get, because even if you want to go pick up somebody, you got to drop somebody.
Yeah.
Well,
my advice here, and sorry to cut you off, Jason, but my piece of advice here if you do have somebody that's questionable, that's playing in a Sunday night or Monday game, and they're a receiver or a running back or whatever it may be, don't leave them in your receiver spot. Put them in your flex spot, because then if they don't end up playing, then you have flexibility to fill that with a running back off of the waiver wire, free agent pool, or a receiver or a tight end when it gets to that game time. If they're locked into your running back spot and then they end up not playing last minute in a late game slate, then it just narrows down your options of that plug and play.
That's interesting, man. That's interesting. Okay, we're going to keep the party rocking and rolling. Let's go to this one is fun. So I can only imagine, and you kind of alluded to it earlier, like sleepers and busts. So you pick somebody who's high and they bust up your schedule because they're not producing, or you have somebody who's high and they get injured, or you don't pick up somebody and somebody else picks up a sleeper. So talk to me about sleepers and busts, and then kind of give me some ideas on who might be some sleepers that you're looking at.
Yeah. So Jayson, you want to start first? You want me to?
Yeah. So, I mean, sleepers or busts would be, if you had a magic ball, 8-ball, that would be the question to ask. Like I said, there's been years where I've had one of the first picks, I've taken a top receiver or quarterback and they get hurt. I mean, last year, I don't know where he was ranked, but I'm sure Aaron Rodgers went very high on a lot of people's, and he gets hurt immediately, and now you're having to change like who you're going to draft or if you've already, like, where you're going to go with your team from this point on, where you're banking on this one guy, and whether it be bust, they just don't play well, or whether it be an injury or whatever it is. That's why I say in the beginning, you have all these rankings and you think, I've got the best. I mean, last year when our draft ended, I had the number 1 ranked team. I finished 9th in our league because throughout the year, guys who were supposed to come to fruition didn't. Or, you know, I would have a game where the guy I'm playing against, he would have, I think it was Josh Allen. He threw for like 5 touchdowns in one game and then rushed for one or something like that. And I'm over here on the other team and I've got the defense who's playing against them, or whatever the case may be. It can be almost a week by week bust because I had a really good team, but they never all produced on the same week. And whoever I was playing had guys come out of nowhere that they just weren't predicted to be like that or to be that good. And I think either Whitlee or Wes brought this up at one point about Dallas's kicker last year. Like, nobody at the beginning of the year would have been like, oh, this is one of the best kickers in the league, and I'm going to draft him. But he ended up getting so many opportunities because of them not really being able to put it in the end zone, but so many field goals that he ended up being one of the best, if not the best kicker. But you don't think about that. And I know the kicker is kind of a different position and not one that you're drafting too high, but you never know. Every year it's funny to look back at the last week compared to the first week and see who was ranked number 1, who ended up number 1, and who was nowhere near their ranking spot.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Whitney.
Yeah, so I would say a bust is usually someone that has high expectations and doesn't meet those expectations. So a lot of people might dog on a player that doesn't do very good, but if someone drafted him in the 10th round, it didn't really cost you anything if he doesn't pan out. Like, their players are drafted in the 10th round for a reason, because there's a lot of factors that might upend their entire season, or they might not get the ball as much as you'd hope. But if you're drafting a guy in the 1st round, 2nd round, they need to play really good. They need to be one of the top producers in the league to pay off on that price of what you paid for them. If they don't, then they bust for your team. And sleepers would just be people that the industry is asleep on, where consensus doesn't have them very high. They think like the case against for that player outweighs the case for, but you're thinking to yourself, hey, I could kind of see how this player could really pop off and really score a lot more touchdowns, have a lot more yards, maybe be featured in their offense more than the industry thinks they will. So, and as far as some busts,
go ahead.
As far as some busts, I mean, in the first, second round. Older players, and all of them are mostly younger than me, but older players for the NFL and really like to be a top producing athlete. If you're a running back and you're 30 years old or close to 30 years old, you don't have much tread left on the tires as far as your NFL career. Now, there's some historical outliers like Adrian Peterson. Derrick Henry so far has been one, but like guys like Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, I'm kind of fading those guys, and they could prove me wrong and not be bust, but I'm not jumping up to grab those guys just because they're older running backs. They've changed teams. There'll eventually be some sort of decline. And both of them have quarterbacks in Lamar Jackson and Jalen Hurts who like to run the ball themselves and not really dump off passes to the running back historically. So I think those guys are being drafted just because they're household names, and I'm probably fading those particular guys. Sleepers, some guys like late in drafts that I think could really do good. One is Josh Palmer on the Los Angeles Chargers. He's pretty much free in drafts, but Keenan Allen and Mike Williams were both on the Chargers last year. Justin Herbert, a really good NFL quarterback who can get his guys the ball with accurate passes, targets that are catchable for his receivers, is still there. Keenan Allen and Mike Williams both left. There's a void of like over 200 targets to be filled this year. And Josh Palmer is a third-year guy. He had a rough start to his rookie season. He really flashed last year when Keenan Allen and Mike Williams, the other receivers, were hurt or not playing. So I think Josh Palmer could emerge in this Chargers receiver room and pay off for players. Rookie-wise, I like Malik Neighbors. He was drafted 6th overall in the NFL draft. People are down on Malik Neighbors compared to another rookie, Marvin Harrison Jr., who got drafted to the Arizona Cardinals. Harrison Jr. is in a really good situation with Kyler Murray as his quarterback. There's also Trey McBride, a tight end who could draw some attention from the defense there. And Marvin Harrison Jr. is a generational talent, as they say, as far as scouts, and played really good at Ohio State. So he's being drafted the later part of the first round, early second round. Malik Neighbors, who was drafted just a couple spots behind him in the NFL draft, is being drafted like in the 4th, sometimes 5th round, because he went to the New York Giants, who were sort of a dumpster fire last year, and have Daniel Jones, who's struggled at QB, supposed to be feeding him the ball. So people are scared because he has Daniel Jones. But when I look around the Giants, I don't see anybody that can compete with Malik Neighbors for targets. And I think he's very close to Marvin Harrison Jr. as a talent. So I'm drafting Malik Neighbors in the 3rd round. If I think I can wait till the 4th or 5th, that's even better. But I think he's a really good sleeper this year.
That's good info.
That's insider information right there.
That's inside, man. I'm excited to get this episode out. But you've already drafted, right? You've already gotten.
Yeah, I drafted like one of my 2 really big leagues. So it's an auction draft. For what it's worth, I mean, I took Anthony Richardson because I think the cheat code as far as fantasy quarterbacks is somebody who runs with their legs, piles up yards, piles up rushing touchdowns on top of whatever they get passing wise. He's a raw, real NFL quarterback, but I think he's going to tuck the ball and run several times a game, give you like a safe fantasy floor. So I drafted Anthony Richardson, Travis Etienne of the Jacksonville Jaguars. He finished as RB5 last year. He just had a bad end of the year, so recency bias is kind of keeping him down as far as his value. But I'm high on him. James Cook on the Buffalo Bills, I'm also really high on him. He finished as RB12 last year. Joe Brady, when he took over as offensive coordinator of the Buffalo Bills, they really featured James Cook. Josh Allen, the quarterback of the Bills, he does vulture a lot of touchdowns from James Cook in the red zone. But I think James Cook's going to catch a lot of passes, get a lot of production between the 20s on offense, and then maybe surprise us and get more rushing touchdowns this year. Then I drafted Justin Jefferson. He went cheaper than he should have, in my opinion. Again, people are worried about Sam Darnold throwing him the ball with Kirk Cousins going to Atlanta. But Justin Jefferson is still Justin Jefferson. And regardless of quarterback, he's averaged about 20 points per game throughout his entire career. So I'm buying the dip on Justin Jefferson. I'm also buying the dip on Cooper Kupp. I got him on my team. Puka Nacua had a sensational rookie year last year, and Cooper Kupp was injured with hamstring and ankle injuries throughout the entire season. His production dipped off, but we're not that far away from Cooper Kupp winning the Triple Crown as far as the receiver in a single season. In 2021, he had the most yards, the most receptions, and the most touchdowns. So Cooper Kupp is getting towards the end of his career. He's on the back nine, but he's coming into this year fully healthy, and the Rams and Sean McVay, their head coach, plans to get him the ball. So I also have Malik Neighbors. I got Jake Ferguson for pretty cheap, the Cowboys tight end, who I think is the second target getter behind CeeDee Lamb, and that's about it for me.
Dang, we got the formula.
Sounds like he's ready, man. That's the formula, the cheat code. Okay, last bit of info for the cheat code. Resources. So fantasy football resources. Where can we go to get up-to-date information? Where can we go to stay in tune, in touch with the league and with all the good stuff? I mean, I've got some ideas of sources, but I want to hear from the experts on the panel. Like, where are the best? You said ADP earlier. Tell me about some of these other spaces to get information and to even find information on sleepers that could exist or bust that may be in the mist. So talk to me.
Yeah, so Fantasy Pros is a really good start. If you go to fantasypros.com, you can look at different experts' rankings, and they'll even have, experts from Yahoo, experts from CBS, from ESPN, that you can tap into their rankings. And I would just select a couple of guys in the industry that I listen to their podcasts and think they're pretty smart and agree with their takes. And then maybe follow those guys on Twitter if you want like really live up-to-date on injuries and things that are happening around the NFL that are fantasy worthy. And they may tell you, hey, go pick up this guy. Like the guy in front of them just got hurt, rush to the waiver wire, pick up the next man up. Or they may say, hey, looking back at the past 3 weeks, like this underlying data is not looking good for this player. You should fade him, try to trade him off your team while you still can and get somebody else. So I would follow experts on Twitter, go to ESPN, Fantasy Pros, Yahoo, CBS. There's a million sites. They all have like fantasy analysts. The fantasy industry has exploded. It's an $18 billion industry now. So you can go on TV and find fantasy football shows. There's a million podcasts you can listen to. For super up-to-date info, I'd go to Twitter and get it that way up to second. And yeah, that's all I got.
Shameless plug. I was about to say. I think there's a podcast that we should probably all be listening to, and that's WXWhy&Z.
Yeah. Yeah, the WXWhy&Z Fantasy Football Podcast. We just started it last year just for fun because we talk about fantasy football and nerd out about it anyways. So we're like, hey, let's just record the conversation. So it's live episodes, unscripted. We just hop on there, click record, and start spitting out stuff about what's going on in fantasy football. But last year we cut it short because Zane and I both had baby girls, and dad is number one priority. So we stopped. We
believe in that on the Dad's Corner.
100%.
Yeah, there you go. This year, we don't have any babies scheduled to pop out, so we're going to see it through the entire NFL season. So every week, we're going to at least try to have one episode, maybe two, to just give out some fantasy analysts. I wish I could speak right now, but give out some analysis as far as fantasy football goes. And since we're a small podcast, we're very interactive. So if someone hops on there, ask us questions, text us questions, we'll talk about it in the episode so people can hop on with our podcast. We want it to be interactive for our league mates. So we encourage.
Where can we find it, Whitlee?
It's on Spotify and Apple Podcast. So WXWhy&Z Fantasy Football Podcast. It's a picture of Bill Belichick sitting on a park bench eating a massive Subway sandwich. And it's that meme, like football is a sandwich, and it says football and me. And so, yeah, that's just our little tag.
Hey, well, and we got one more thing because we thought about this earlier. What's been the fun? Y'all have punishment for whoever gets last place, Whitley?
It was supposed to be spend 24 hours straight in a Waffle House, and for every waffle you eat, you could deduct 1 hour from your time spent there. So that was supposed to be the punishment, but it has not been carried out yet.
So
That
ours
is
was
something.
whoever got last place had to do an entire 18 holes of golf in women's clothing. And
Oh my
so
god.
they just got through. And so shout out to Gilbert for, let's see, for playing in a women's clothing. He played an entire round of golf. And
Is that why you're here? Are you not entertained?
oh, that's great. So that's what we do. I've heard some some other good ones, but it's always fun because that way, I mean, you're wanting to win the money, but that way you also don't want it. You can't, because we used to have a problem of like a guy would not show up for the draft, his team would be auto drafted, he'd lose the first 2 or 3 weeks, and then he'd just be like, "Well, I don't care." And so then this like keeps it to where you got to pay attention, you got to stay involved, or because you don't want to get last place.
That's good. That's
Yeah.
good stuff. That's good stuff. That's funny.
Yep.
Yeah,
So-
I hope people listen to this episode or watch this episode. And if you haven't played fantasy football, I hope you're intrigued enough to sign up for a league this year. There's still time before Thursday night kickoff next week with the Chiefs and the Ravens. And if you do play fantasy football, hopefully either on the Dad's Corner or hop over to our podcast and kind of get some more in-depth, high-level research, analysis, whatever you want to call it, as far as diving into the weeds of fantasy football.
Yeah, don't forget, check it out. It's a great, like you said, it's not up to the minute stuff, but it's just a good recap, a good look ahead podcast for what's coming up on the week ahead. And trust me, everybody can use any extra help they can when it comes to trying to keep up with what's going on in the NFL.
Well, Whitley, dude, thank you so much for your time, man. You're the first guest on the Dad's Corner Sportscast. Like
First episode, first guest.
First episode,
Honored.
first guest. It's super awesome. I know that this is going to be something that we're going to continue to do, and we don't know what our frequency will be with this. This is something that we have a little bit more flexibility, so we'll do this a lot more often probably, and maybe we'll have some more fantasy football segments, and you can come be our expert some more. Like, you've given us some really good tips. I appreciate you. I feel like I have a better grasp of fantasy football and how to move forward, and like you said, I got a week, so I'm probably about to.
Hey, we may need to set up a Dad's
I know.
Corner fantasy league.
I think that would be cool. So I'll put you in charge of that, Jason. Like, if you want to figure out how to do that, and I'll help any way that I can. So I think that'll be fun.
Yeah. Appreciate it, Whitley, buddy. I appreciate you hopping on, man, and especially just sharing kind of some of your knowledge on. I've done it for so long, but even hearing you speak, I'm like, that's pretty good. It's a pretty good point, especially the running backs and their age and how that never has really panned out.
Keep an eye on that.
Yeah.
For sure. I appreciate y'all letting me hop on. I'm honored to hop on. First time guest, but long time listener, and plan to be a long time listener. I love the Dad Corner pod. So thank
Hell
you.
yeah.
Awesome. Jason.
Hey, well, we got one more thing before we leave. Shut the dang door. Let's go.
Break. All right, y'all.